Hello, my dear listeners. Here I am making a second episode of the Softest Timeline podcast because I feel inspired and I was so happy to hear from some of you that you really liked my first episode. And yeah, that really inspired me to continue on and creating this space and maybe start inviting guests at some point. If you have any ideas or topics you would like to talk about or hear about, please let me know. And if you really liked the podcast, and you want to give it a 5-star review on Spotify, that would be wonderful. Because apparently that helps to reach a few more people out there that could be part of the community of the Softest Timeline podcast. And the Softest Timeline, I actually wanted to say a few words for what that means for me and why I chose that title. I chose it because I actually never resonated with a world that surrounds us in so many ways that demands us to be loud and tough and always on and pushing through. And I always felt something is wrong with me for being too sensitive, for too much stimulation. And it never resonated with me to be loud or having to perform or anything like that, or like pushing through, not feeling well. But I find that these qualities are really valued in our society. And of course, they have their place and are really important in some contexts. But what I've seen, especially through Ayurveda in the space of holistic healing, is how this harshness in the world is making so many women and humans sick and burned out and not feeling themselves. And I do find that on a human level, being rough and disciplined and focused has been over glorified, and it has created massive imbalances in this world in all areas of life, specifically, of course, through patriarchal capitalist systems, white supremacy, and colonization. So when I talk about the feminine and bringing it back into balance, it means reclaiming it and honoring it and living it. And I think through different topics, we will explore what that means. But it's really important to mention that this is not gender specific. This reclamation is important for everyone, for a man, for a woman, for non-binary, for trans people, everyone, and also the planet in general. It is important that we find balance of these energies and forces. And yes, of course, women often feel closer to the feminine and men feel closer to masculine energies. But for example, a man can also operate from a very feminine way and vice versa. So gender is really just a spectrum on which we explore between these dualities, and we need both. So we know this from ancient traditions that in a world of duality, both are inherent parts of life. Yin and yang, Shiva and Shakti, we need both equally. But the feminine has been actively suppressed and ignored and shut down externally and within us. And that is why we want to reclaim it and bring it back. So in my world, I want to highlight the feminine so we can start reclaiming it and we can start reconnecting to it in a very inclusive way. But it does mean that the masculine isn't needed. It is equally needed. And I really believe that softness is kind of a real revolution today. I think softness has purposefully been giving the connotation of weakness, but that is not true. On the contrary, softness can be very fierce because it holds space for vulnerability and for wildness and for interconnectedness of all things, and maybe even a deeper transformation. It is able to hold a lot at the same time. So yes, if this makes sense to you and if it resonates with you, welcome, you're at the right space. And let's create this space together. And yes, I would assume that some of the topics I talk about might be a little bit more interesting for women or non-binary people, but I think it would be amazing for men to listen and open up more to women's perspectives and realities while we explore this path of the softest timeline. So today I want to talk about something I've noticed a lot while working with Ayurvedic concepts and practices. And it is because I observed how we tend to think in good and bad boxes, in black and white. And this also shows how we are experiencing and working with duality. I observed that we want to believe there is a good way or a better way to do things, and then we judge ourselves and others according to this black and white worldview we somehow create for ourselves. I especially observed this when it comes to health and healing and living a perfect lifestyle. We end up in loops of gaining new knowledge and then observing and judging ourselves for doing well or not doing well. But I think this applies to how we approach life in general. We're so wired to judge and categorize things into good and bad, into progress and regression. And that means we mostly live life from linear thinking, with the idea or the search for some ideal, some perfect way to live life, perfectionism. And I do see directly in the healing and wellness space how this actually holds us back from what we actually want, which is a healthier, more balanced, and more enjoyable life. So, what I want to question in this episode is why are we, either consciously or unconsciously, wired to label things as good and bad? Why do we think we need to do everything perfectly, to be, purist in a way in order to live a healthy and balanced life? Or even further, why do we have to do everything perfectly to be worthy of healing? Because I do believe this mindset is holding us back actually from real health, real balance, and real equilibrium. I think it disconnects us from being in tune and in relationship with our bodies and from our intuition, from our natural rhythms, from a more aligned and a flowing state of being. And the most interesting part for me is actually how this all relates to the suppression of feminine ways of being. This urge to hyperanalyze and categorize and separate and label our life into ideal and failure. In my opinion, this shows that we're living with colonized minds, where the mind runs the show from a colonized mindset. And this mindset perpetuates a disconnect from feminine ways, from feminine balance. And I want to share with you a theory that has fascinated me lately that explores the question what this linear thinking actually has to do with us as humans becoming literate, meaning learning alphabetic languages and the alphabet. Okay, so let's start with the urge to label things as good and bad. This need to categorize things into good and bad, lifestyle, food habits, exercise, or whatever it is, comes from an illusion that self-improvement and health and happiness or life in general is linear, meaning something we can achieve or become. And also the idea that we can maybe hack our human nature and find the perfect path for self-improvement and health and happiness. And I have to laugh about myself because I have consumed so much information in the past decade trying to figure out what is this human experience and what is this world about. And I was reading and learning about countless of systems to self-improve and how to make things right and avoid doing things wrong, and also how to improve not only individually but also society and our world, which I think is a good thing to have this motivation to do better and create a better world. And I tried to figure out all these ways to do things right in my life, only to realize at some point that if we zoom out beyond the ego, there is no right and wrong. And from a natural perspective, everything is neutral. There is no value tied to anything. There just is, right? There is light and dark, day and night. And then if we zoom back in to understand that what is right for somebody can be wrong for someone else and vice versa. And that there are seasons for things to be right and wrong and different paths and different journeys. And there's no one general best path for humans. So anyways, whether something is right or wrong depends massively on perspective and also on how deeply the observer, the person's perspective, is rooted in the need to categorize things in order to reduce the complexity of life, the complexity that our human brain can somehow grasp, but not fully understand. So this is all a little bit abstract. So here are some examples of what I'm talking about. So I advocated for veganism in the past because I was working for animal rights organizations. And what often happened was people would say, I could never become vegan because then I would never be allowed to eat cheese or meat or fish anymore. It's too extreme. And they were completely rejecting the idea of veganism or a plant-based diet as something extreme. Equally, from the people within the movement, there was very much the communication all or nothing. Like you are either vegan or you're not vegan if you eat like one egg per week or whatever. Which of course signals that choosing veganism as a lifestyle and a mostly plant-based diet specifically for ethical reasons forces you into a fixed system where you do it either perfectly and never eat any animal products, or you don't do it at all and kind of ignore the problem of animal suffering, which never made sense to me because why does it have to be one way or the other? I'm convinced that we would massively lower the consumption of animal products in general if we would advocate for an ethical approach that operates on a broader spectrum than for an all or nothing approach. Why? Because more people would feel included, more would feel, this is for me, and I'm going to try to best to look for plant-based options or for ethical products. And as a consequence, more animal products would be reduced. So I was always wondering, why can't we eat mostly plant-based and incorporate a little bit of animal products without rejecting those people completely who want to keep doing animal products? And another example is, as I mentioned in the beginning, Ayurveda. So I observed that often when somebody is starting off with Ayurveda or even yoga, learning about different practices and experiencing them and feeling good and feeling that it works and the system really resonates, there's this tendency of how the system and the suggestions of yoga and Ayurveda are quickly internalized as rigid rules instead of guidelines. And also how fast many of us start labeling things as good and bad and according to what the suggestions are. So I observed that it happens often that, for example, if someone is suggested to reduce snacking for better digestion, the person often starts labeling snacking as something bad. And they start calling a day having a good eating day if they have been able to avoid snacks and felt less bloated. And I think this is just a really good example for how the human brain tends to work. And again, it's beautiful when somebody embraces a new habit and has the motivation to choose new habits that resonate and make them feel better. But I feel it's also very interesting how fast the black and white thinking comes in. And food is a great example because yes, Ayurveda suggests certain foods and certain food habits to keep balance, but that doesn't mean that the foods and the practices we're asked to reduce automatically become bad or demonized just because there's this new awareness. The awareness helps us to make better choices, but we don't have to swing from one extreme to the other or categorize things as good and bad. And I find, for example, I have this friend and she once told me she will never get rid of eating cake, even if she's following a healthy diet. And I love that because cake, at least a good one, one made with the love of a mom or a grandma and not the store-bought one, but maybe even those in some moments. They are, this abundance in food form. Of course, we know that cake usually don't have the best nutrients for balance from a health perspective, from a nutritious perspective, like sugar and a lot of fat and stuff. And probably we shouldn't eat it every day to keep our balance. But that doesn't mean that cake is something bad. And if we think about balance, if you eat one piece of cake occasionally, it's unlikely to throw you off balance, unless you're allergic or intolerant to some of the ingredients. And then there's another level that comes in that we don't just want to nourish the physical body, we also want to nourish the heart and the soul. And a moist, generous piece of cake that tastes like a hug from your soul, a hug from a grandmother. And if you really take the time to enjoy it in presence, either alone or with loved ones, the cake becomes medicine on a deeper level. And now we see that one and the same thing cannot be ideal in some situations and perfect in other situations. And this is really important to understand for people that want to learn more about Ayurveda, at least the feminine form of Ayurveda, that just because we're following an Ayurvedic lifestyle and practices and approach, we don't have to move our perception to Ayurveda doesn't allow eating cake, or I'm not allowed to eat cake anymore because cake is bad. But to understand that in a certain moment, it might actually be suggested, So we noticed that holding that spectrum of possibilities and using discernment in each given moment to when something might be beneficial or needed and when it should better be avoided in order for someone to feel better is a constant ongoing evaluation of our own needs, an ongoing conversation with ourselves, our bodies, our hearts, our emotions. So to me, it does seem that categorizing things in black and white is easier and arguably a little bit lazier way, but it moves us further from our intuition and our attunement and our own overall balance and holistic health. And honestly, I think, as I said, this applies to all human life, but food is just a really great example because, for example, Ayurveda is already a very holistic approach, but many of the modern can often be quite extreme and rigid, like raw vegan and keto and paleo, carnivore, fruitarian, where the foods are categorized as either allowed or taboo. Like, why are we doing that? Why are we so obsessed with black and white and a full yes or no? And the funny thing is, people often nowadays swing from one extreme to another. Maybe some of you have noticed like the amount of vegan influencers who became full-on carnivores in the last years. It's just really funny and interesting to see. So I've been wondering, why do humans do this? Why is it so hard to be open to nuance and to allow other perspectives on the spectrum, other realities on the spectrum for others, for ourselves? And I think part of it might just simply be information overload, because so much info is coming in on a daily basis and it's exponentially growing, and our brain needs ways to reduce complexity, to, quite frankly, stay sane and to hold on to something, aka to keep control. But an important thing to notice is that this way of thinking, the black and white, the analyzing, categorizing, linear thinking, is specifically governed by the left brain. So it raises the question, is this tendency something behavioral, cultural, or is it programmed within our brains already? And I read this really interesting book called Alphabet versus the Goddess. And many of my friends heard me talking about it already, so my apologies if you're listening and I'm talking about it again, but it's just really interesting. So the author, Leonard Schlein, excuse me, maybe I'm butchering the name, opens the book with a provocative thesis. And he says that the rise of alphabetic literacy in cultures throughout history has simultaneously led to the decline of feminine power, of goddess worship, and right brain, meaning intuitive and holistic thinking. So in research for this thesis, he explains again that our brain is divided into two hemispheres. We know this, right? The left brain, which is more linear, logical, sequential, reductionist, and associated with masculinity. And the right brain is more holistic, intuitive, image-based, empathetic, and associated with femininity. And then he goes on explaining how learning to read and write, specifically alphabetic scriptures, activates and strengthens the left hemisphere, and how this created a cultural shift towards logic and abstraction and hierarchy and order, and a shift away from embodied and intuitive and relational thinking and knowing. So then he goes on exploring through his research how, as many societies became literate with alphabetic writing, there's often a sharp decline in feminine spiritual archetypes like goddesses and priestesses and matrilineal power, and a rise in patriarchal systems, bringing monotheistic male gods and male-dominated religious hierarchies and war and kind of rigid morality. And he brings in, historical examples like Mesopotamia and Egypt, where there were goddess-centric cultures thriving in those pre-literate times, but then they had a decline after those writing systems became institutionalized. And he builds a contrast between image-based language systems, like, for example, Chinese characters or hieroglyphics, and the phonetic alphabets, suggesting that the image-based systems preserve more the feminine and holistic balance. because these images or pictographs are perceived without having just one word or meaning attached to it. Instead, they are perceived as an image that can exclude or include a multitude of things simultaneously that are perceived all at once, not in a linear way, like a word or a sentence is, letter by letter. And the pictographs are more relational, depending on the observer. Now, this is just a theory, and some might call it radical, but when I first read this theory, it blew my mind, and it just made a lot of sense to me, because that would literally mean that we trained our brains to suppress the feminine by teaching ourselves to read and communicate in linear languages. And that would mean that we taught ourselves to live from a place of linear thinking, left brain thinking, that has led to a cultural shift to hierarchy and orders. So this theory not only supports what we know on a cultural level, which is the fact that we have lost touch with a way of living that is founded in the earth-based wisdom, in attunement to earth and nature, and perceiving ourselves as a part of an interconnected web of everything and the feminine ways of living. But it also provides a theory how we have lost touch to a whole way of thinking and knowing and perceiving the world on a cellular level, meaning we have lost touch with the soft, intuitive, nonlinear intelligence of the right hemisphere, the wisdom of the goddess, which is a perception that includes a concept of a reality that is inclusive, that is horizontal rather than being linear and hierarchical. I find this idea fascinating. It makes a lot of sense to me, and let me know what you think in the comments. So if we go back to categorize things as right and wrong, for example, lifestyle practices, nutrition, exercise, or whatever, it implies that there is a right path or right way of doing things, right? And being on the right path implies a single linear goal-oriented trajectory, which is rooted in left brain logic. So if we follow that idea, this mirrors a very masculine colonial mindset that favors hierarchy over interconnection, that worships progress and productivity over presence and process, and that reduces life to binaries like right and wrong, success and failure, saved and unsaved. And in this worldview, if we're not progressing forward in a straight line, like in career or healing or goals, we're failing. Whereas bringing in a more feminine, cyclical, and indigenous perspective, healing and evolution are not linear, but spiral-shaped and seasonal. And there is not one path, not one way of doing things, but many ways to walk with the earth and the cosmos and spirit. And even these off-path moments that in modern society we would label as failures or backlash or something like that are often seen as, sacred initiations, not failures, but crucial part of the journey. From a more feminine perspective, when we ask ourselves, am I on the right path? Am I doing the right thing? We don't necessarily have to adapt to a framework and stick to it no matter what, or live in it and with it and in an all or nothing approach. But we can soften the question into, am I walking in integrity with my body's wisdom and the earth's rhythm and my soul's truth, even if it looks imperfect and slow and strange and messy and different from anyone else? Because from this more feminine and cyclical and earth-based worldview, there is no such thing as being on the wrong path, because we are already here, we are living, which is quite frankly a miracle, and most of us are literally doing our best. And that is enough. Yes, we do strive for a better life, we do strive for a better world, but in this perspective, we anyways already are enough. No matter what, even if we make mistakes, we are always on the right path, because every single one of us is on a unique journey. And there's so much beauty and knowledge that opens up when we are able to bring our attention inwards, a movement that is called pratyahara in yoga, and learn how to listen within and learn how to connecting to ourselves instead of looking for answers for the right path outside of ourselves constantly. And then maybe living somebody else's dream by buying their worldview their perspective, their ideas, just because they are loud enough and good at making it seem something factual and maybe today being good at marketing. And I think it's quite important for us to soften from black and white thinking to a more holistic and inclusive way of seeing the world. And by the way, all that doesn't mean that we cannot have strong opinions and, experience one part of life completely on one side of the spectrum or in one extreme. I do have really strong opinions on human rights and that every life should be protected. And I would definitely strongly defend that. But that is actually another reason why I think this shift is really important is for ethical reasons. Because we're living in a world where what we do affects not only ourselves, but other beings and the world around us. And as mentioned before, patriarchal, colonial, and capitalist systems tend to reduce morality to those rigid binaries of right and wrong and success and failure and pure and impure, and aka this linear and black and white thinking, which has resulted in so many social and political and ecological issues we're facing today, where even if we have the best intentions, we often create and reproduce and operate within a framework of separation. But the feminine way is rooted in interconnection. The feminine ethics are based on compassion and community and awareness about ecosystems. It includes not only caring for our own path, because we are part of a whole ecosystem, a world of plants and animals and elements. One of the first yogic principles means non-harm, Ahimsa, which, means non-harm not in a rigid or performative way, but as a loving commitment to not extract and dominate the world or the planet or nature, but to co-create in reciprocity. Because we're not here to dominate the earth or even our bodies. We're here to be in integrity with the whole. So yes, as humanity, I think it's really important that we start again to connect with what is within and to unlearn colonial and patriarchal programming, which the linear and hierarchical worldview and thinking patterns are patriarchal programming. And it's important for us to decolonize our brains. So in Ayurveda, at least the feminine form of Ayurveda that I have learned and studied and practiced, what is really in the center is balance, not perfection. And on the contrary of what these rigid binary ways of thinking have brought to us, balance is not a static point. It's more like a wave, like a dance. It's like nature, where we are always shifting daily and seasonally and hormonally and emotionally, specifically women. And having or them forced into a linear way of living is deeply misaligned with their essence. And actually, Ayurveda honors that through the daily practices, the dinacharya, the art of aligning our daily rhythms with the rhythms of nature. For example, when we wake up with the sun and we eat with the sun, with the light, and we rest when it's dark. And our system, if we follow that, our systems begin to regulate and heal and return to natural equilibrium. We realize that balance is not about achieving a perfect, fixed, even clear state, like, for example, a state of always choosing the healthiest food, the best exercise, or even a permanent certain mind state. But balance itself is a living practice itself. And balance then is the choice to return to yourself again and again after whatever, after burnout, after contraction, after forgetting. Every time you come back to yourself, your body, your value, your truth, that is also balance, and it's included in the feminine path. So I want to come to an end by kind of, again, challenging this mindset of health and healing as a point of arrival at a good path, or moving out of a bad one or not ideal one and bad practices. Because in my experience, every Ayurvedic practitioner, every honest teacher, every master I have met would tell you that balance is an ongoing process and an ongoing integration and an ongoing interaction with you and the world around you, and it will never end until the day we die. And that includes going out of balance, maybe even consciously going out of balance. What matters most is the awareness of what is happening and the willingness to come back into balance and create balance. So the feminine approach is more centered on wholeness of body, mind, and heart, and spirit, and soul. And when we are on a healing path towards more balance, we're not just fixing problems, which would be a masculine approach, but we're getting reminded of our wholeness. And that is also, for example, integrated in the tantric path that embraces both light and shadow as sacred, and actually seeing liberation in and through embodied presence and sensuality and the alchemy of everyday life. The wholeness, where we can hold joy and grief at the same time, and progress and pain and light and dark. And I feel that's really a soft embodied rebellion against a system that told us that we had to earn our balance and our wholeness and our worth by being consistent and perfect and easy to understand and easy to digest and easy to be put in a box. And another thing I want to mention when it comes to the black and white thinking and the rigid rules, and it's that we need to come back to trust our body's wisdom, because our body is always on our side. But I think so many of us, through the Western socialization, have outsourced the health and wellness discussion to external frameworks and teachers and doctors and science and pharma, which of course all has its place, and always use your discernment of who is your teacher and who is your doctor. But today we don't know how to listen to our bodies and feel our bodies anymore. We forgot how it communicates. And then we even tend to judge the body for not doing what it's supposed to do the wrong things, or to not working properly and not looking perfectly and healthy and being vital. But what I learned through Ayurveda is that even when there's pain or illness or emotional overwhelm or imbalances, the body is not betraying us. It's not working against us. The body is working for us, and it's communicating and it's striving for balance. Actually, even in the moment of death, it's trying to create balance. When a last breath cannot be taken anymore, when the bodily functions cannot be continued on a healthy level, death is the most aligned thing to happen for overall balance. So in its natural state, the body is doing exactly what it's designed to do: to protect, to process, to adapt, and to signal when something is out of alignment. But in modern life, especially under capitalist patriarchal systems, we're taught to override the body and to hustle through fatigue and to numb emotional discomfort and to mistrust our instincts. But in Ayurveda, every symptom is actually a message, not something inherently bad or necessarily a malfunction. So at the end of this, I also want to advocate again and invite compassion towards the body, because decoding the body's messages with Ayurvedic wisdom means learning to listen deeply and honoring the rhythms and responding with care, not control. That is the difference. Responding with care, but not control. And it's a return to this kind of relationship rather than domination of the body, of nature. And that changes everything. So in the light of all of this, if you're on a journey towards healing or more balance or a more fulfilling life and lifestyle, I would love to invite you to reflect on some questions like, where am I holding a black and white view, specifically in the area of healing and balance and wellness and growth? And can I open up my perspective? Can I bring in more compassion? Can I invite nuance and look at a bigger spectrum and be fine with what I see and feel safe in my nervous system to allow moving around the spectrum? And can I meet myself in the in-between? Is it beneficial for me in this moment to control something or to allow flow with the cycle and the spiral? And if you feel disconnected from your body and your intuition and you feel you need a little bit support, I will be able to open offers in the Ayurveda space soon. in form of health counseling, but also education. And of course, stay tuned for what comes next in the podcast, because we are going to continue to have these kind of reflections and discussions. And I really hope this was interesting or helpful for some of you. Let me know what resonated with you. And if you found it interesting or helpful, share it with your friends and your loved ones so we can bring more softness into the holistic healing of our bodies and our minds, and to decolonize our bodies and our minds, and to find our way into collective equilibrium. And thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I wish you have a wonderful day.